Hi, we continue in Luke 22 today after Jesus has prayed that the cup might pass him by and has prayed that the disciples might pray that the time of trial might pass them by, but instead has found them sleeping. And now, as he expected, suddenly like a thief in the night, Judas comes with the arresting party and the disciples are nowhere to be seen. So as we enter into our story, you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following the shape of Luke 22 and 23, and we're down to this section here. Jesus is arrested, and you see that's not directly one of the chiasms we see here, but it can also be seen as part of the larger chiasm, as I'll show you in just a minute. In fact, why don't we look at that right now, so we can see where our unit is, which is right here, and we've just finished this very clean chiasm here that begins and ends with the exact same phrase, pray that you may not come into the time of trial. And as I was noting last time in the video before, we could also include today's section, at least, well, this much of it, this is today's section here, between the two boxes, as part of a larger chiasm, including this up here, because both this section up here and this section down here have in common unnamed people, they in both cases, directing speech to Jesus, starting with Lord and around the question of swords. And then both of them also have sword in the singular and sword in the plural, singular and plural here. So we could certainly see that the prayer section is the antidote to the issue of the sword. And that's what comes up here. Because if they were prayed up as Jesus is and not sleeping, they wouldn't be tempted to strike with the sword, acting in that fear or flight mode that we all act with unless we're centered in the Creator who gives us our being and sustains us through all things. So that's where we are in the story right there. And as we look at it in comparison, not only with Mark and Matthew, but with John, because Jesus is certainly arrested in all four Gospels, we can see again how Luke is taking the tradition from Mark, but radically reshaping it for his own purposes. And it's just another example. If you haven't watched the introductory video to Luke 22 and 23, I really encourage you to do so. So you can see how, although scholars and even ordinary folks tend to see Mark, Matthew, and Luke as the synoptic Gospels, synoptic meaning seeing with the same eye, Luke is in many ways very different. So what we see here in the plain type is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have in common, and John has a little of that in common. The blue is what's in common to Mark and Matthew that's not in Luke. So if we see the part that's plain and the part that's blue, we see there's quite a bit that's common in Mark and Matthew. But Matthew has also added this section here about what about the sword and the question of legions of angels. So Matthew has that particular piece. But we see Luke only has a few little pieces of what was there from Mark. And he has those exactly, so it's not like he doesn't know Mark. But he's continuing his theme about the question of the sword, structuring it into the chiastic shape that I was just showing you. And then he has the healing of the high priest servant whose ear was cut off. Curiously, Luke has in common with John the right ear, which I'll note now, and we'll see in the story, indicates striking from behind. But it's one of a number of little details, not so many here, but little details that connect Luke with John. So although we traditionally see Matthew, Mark, Luke as synoptic and John is different, and John, as you can see, is very different, the part that's in bold is the part that's unique to John, and only these few little pieces are in common with the others. Still, there are some interesting pieces that connect Luke with John, but we're not going to look at that detail now. So I'll leave this up as we begin to focus on our passage here, starting in verse 47. And we see that it happens all at once. So while he was still speaking, suddenly, although the word suddenly is idu, which literally means behold. And the text in the Greek is even more dramatic than the translation, which makes it flow a little more smoothly than the literal Greek does, because there's no verb here for crowd, or for came. So literally, while he was still speaking, look, a crowd. And so that happens all at once, seemingly completely out of nowhere on the Mount of Olives. And interestingly, the betrayer is called the one called Judas. Now, we already know his name, Judas. The chapter started with Judas turning himself over to the chief priests and their soldiers to conspire to tell them where Jesus was, and they gave him money. But it's not the one named Judas. It's called legemenos, as you can see in my note down below. And it suggests some implicit question about, is that his real identity? He's called Judas, but is he really something else? The only time we've seen seen something called was with Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, also called Passover. There's certainly no question of whether it was called Passover. And so we could read those in parallel and suggest there's really no question about it being Judas. And there doesn't seem to be any question. But still, it's an odd way to refer to it, as if there is some question there. We'll hear from Judas again at Acts 1:16. Not Judas live, of course, Judas dying there, but this is his last appearance here. Described again as one of the 12, as he's been all along. And he's described as leading them. And that's unique to Luke, as we can see here. He's not described that way otherwise. Notice that Luke starts off with just a crowd, whereas Mark and Matthew have a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and scribes, and Mark has with the elders. Matthew has the elders of the people in particular there. I should have had the elders in blue there, because that is in common to both. But we only find out down here that Jesus said to the chief priests and the temple soldiers and the elders who would come for him. So at the beginning, we just sense that it's a crowd with Judas, and we don't understand exactly who it is. An element of suspense that Luke is putting in there. And so it says he's leading them here. One of the many echoes back to the first chapter, so we see it there and here, just at the beginning and here, to kiss him. Notice it doesn't say he actually did kiss him. He approached him to kiss him, and Jesus says to him, Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man? But now the scene is interrupted by those who ask the question about the sword. So we don't actually see that he kisses him here. The verb for to kiss here, philese here, is an interesting use of the verb. It literally means to be friendly with, or to love, as it's sometimes translated. It's only here as a kiss in Luke's Gospel, and it's only one other time in Luke Acts altogether where it's referring to what people love. Although it's 25 times in the New Testament, but never as kiss. Is it possible we could understand it some other way? Well, probably not, but it is found in these 5 letters, 4 of Paul and 1 of Peter, as an expression of offering a holy kiss to those who were there in the speaker's absence, the letter writer's absence. So there it certainly is expressed as a holy kiss, and that's understood as what we understand as a kiss of mouths touching each other, or mouths touching cheeks at least. So that appears to be what he's doing. And the intimacy of that, of course, is the great irony here, and that's what Jesus brings up in his response, as we'll see here. So my note below says about the question of the emotion of the scene. Green notes, Jesus, who had struggled in prayer, comes to this encounter in a state of composed mastery. His disciples, who have been sleeping rather than praying, face the ordeal with agitation and miscomprehension. But Brittany Wilson, who I've been noting the last couple of videos, counters the standard view among many scholars that Jesus is fitting here within Luke's portrait of a stoic, noble death, that he's going without emotion and without fear, and he's modeling a form of death. Certainly in John's Gospel, that's explicitly the case in the use of the word hypodegma, translated as an example or a model of death, echoing Maccabees. But we don't have that here in Luke. Instead, Wilson notes, here Jesus has an emotionally charged interaction with Judas. Jesus' query becomes all the more poignant, and Judas' betrayal all the more unsettling, since kissing conveys emotional intimacy elsewhere in Luke Acts. And the only other time we hear of kissing is back with the woman from the city who is kissing Jesus' feet and anointing his feet with her hair. So certainly it was an emotional, affective point of intimate connection there, and there's no reason to think it's not here. So again, Wilson undercutting the argument that Luke is trying to comply with the notion that his audience would expect Jesus to fit a Roman gentleman. But as I've been noting throughout, Luke is not trying to get Jesus to fit within the Roman world, but to get his audience to realize that they should rebel against the Roman world and side with Jesus. So, unique to Luke, Jesus says to Judas, Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the human one? Notice in Matthew it has, friend, do what you are here to do. And in Mark, there's nothing. So Matthew and Luke both add a comment here of Jesus responding to the betrayal by Judas. And he addresses him by name. There's no question of so-called Judas. Is it with a kiss that you are betraying the human one? And the answer is yes, plainly, but we don't get a response from Judas. And now we get to the crowd, but this is ambiguous. When those who were around him Is it the disciples that are no longer mentioned? Is it the apostles? Or is it simply the crowd that came out to arrest it? It certainly suggests from the question that those are the same people that were asking here about 2 swords and should we have more swords. But it's ambiguous. Is it framed in this way because at this moment they're not disciples, that they betrayed Jesus by having their hand on the table and being asleep while he's praying? Could be. And certainly the next scene with Peter explicitly saying, I don't know him, twice, and denying that he's a disciple, certainly would fit with that sense of not being a disciple at this moment. And as I was noting in the last video about the question of the purse and the bag and the sword, this is a unique moment here where they're in between their faith stance earlier and their recovered faith that we'll see after the resurrection, and with the gift of the Holy Spirit that we'll see in Acts. So these people see what was coming, or literally the things that will be being, which is an awkward phrase in English, but that's what they see. And there's no difficulty in seeing with this crowd that what's coming. They ask, Lord, should we strike with the sword? And the fact that they're calling him Lord certainly suggests they're subservient to his mastery here. Mattson notes the connection with Acts 1:6, where they ask the question, Lord, is now the time you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel, as both expressing the same misunderstanding that Jesus coming to Jerusalem means the Messiah on the white horse, so to speak, is going to come and whoop the Romans and put these people in charge. But as we saw from the parable he told in 1911 and following, that is not the case at all. So they ask the question, should we strike with the sword, using the verb patasso, only here in the next verse in Luke, interestingly. It's parallel in Matthew 26, as similar here. With the sword, and using the same word for sword as we saw earlier. And that's what fits the issue of the sword up here. And before they can get an answer to the question, one of them, not Peter as named in the situation here, where we're told Simon Peter had the sword in John's Gospel, and we don't hear that here. In Mark, it was simply one of those who stood near, like it is here. So we don't have in Luke the specification of who it is, but it happens before the answer to the question. So the impatience is what we note. One of them struck the slave of the high priest, the most vulnerable person in the group. We hadn't known that the slave of the high priest was there, but there that person is, and we discover it's a he with the pronoun here. And cut off his right ear, otherwise the verb for take away, which can also mean cut off, and it's used in John's Gospel for pruning as well. So it can be for cutting vines or cutting off parts of a person that aren't fruitful, at least metaphorically. The right ear highlights, and if you can picture it, you can imagine it for yourself. How do you cut off someone's right ear with a sword? Well, not very easily from in front. So it suggests from behind a cowardly attack there. It's an interesting detail that although, as you can see from my note below, that ear is used in Luke earlier a number of times, usually let those who have ears to hear, that all 4 Gospels have this detail about someone having the high priest slave having their ear cut off. It's a curious little detail that they all have in common. But now we get to the key issue that's so controversial around the issue of the swords and otherwise. So Jesus says, no more of this. And the Greek phrase that you can see down below, ete heus tauto, literally means be you letting until this. And the question that scholars have to face is he saying no more violence altogether, no more using the sword, or that's simply enough for now? Or how do we interpret that? So Mattson argues that the translation here and similar elsewhere is totally wrong. He says, quote, instead of rebuking his disciples, Jesus is reminding his disciples of the divine plan to which both he and they must submit. Thus, something like, quote, permit them as far as this, unquote, or, quote, permit them up to this point, unquote, or contextually, quote, allow them to continue with the arrest, unquote. In other words, Jesus is responding to the question in verse 49, should we strike with the sword, not the incident in verse 50. And he argues a long history of translation, that first the RSV, which is from the World War I era, then the new RSV, which is the post-World War II era, had a reticence to suggest violence was acceptable. And that was part of the entire biblical realm's response to Hitler, and especially to the Holocaust after World War II, recognizing how their translations often allowed people to read anti-Judaism into the New Testament, which many still read falsely in there, because not all translations correct. For example, the language of Jews in John's Gospel. That's for my John series, not for this one, of course, but part of the larger context of translation. So he says the original was let this go no further, which Mattson calls, quote unquote, itself problematic. So he adds in a different piece, the swords function literally to get Jesus safely to the Mount of Olives, advancing the plot of the story and setting in motion the particulars of the divine plan. In other words, his argument is that the swords were there to protect Jesus in going from the upper room to the Mount of Olives for his prayer, but only for that purpose, but that the arrest, which is part of the divine plan, must take place. For those who want to argue, as I was making the point when we looked at the previous section about the swords, about this being the abstract question of does Jesus allow self-defense or violence, we certainly note that, first of all, asking the question out of context almost always leads to a bad answer. But the idea that Jesus is allowing some self-defense is plainly contrary to the fact that Jesus isn't wanting to be defended. That he's being arrested, they're not defending him, they're not preventing the arrest, that the arrest needs to go forward because this is part of God's plan. And I've been saying repeatedly throughout this unit, Luke leaves in tension the sense of God's boule, the plan, and human free will, including Judas's, to choose what to do or not, and the disciples choosing whether to go to sleep or to stay with Jesus and pray and be ready. So we try to rationally sort that out. We can't any more than we can rationally sort out the question of Jesus being both God and human, but they're both there. So however we interpret that, is it simply enough to let them to get to this point, or it was just a symbol, as I was suggesting, that he's saying you shouldn't be striking with the sword altogether. Jesus acts to heal. He touches the ear and heals him. There aren't that many places where Jesus heals by touch. Usually it's your faith has healed you or saved you, as we've seen, including recently around the question of faith. But here we have that. So then, having corrected the error of the disciples here, or whoever it was, those who were around him who strike, Jesus says to the newly revealed chief priests, and as I've been noting, the temple police is completely anachronistically wrong here. Police is a modern concept, completely foreign to the ancient world, and the word strategos means soldiers. So the temple soldiers and the chief priests, but here also the elders who had come for him, who were otherwise not involved in the conspiracy. They'd only been mentioned at 21 at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry in Jerusalem, and so it's curious that they're mentioned here who had come for him. And the word for having come for, paraginomai, as we see a number of times, but it's suggesting that both in this and here that he's surrounded by these people. And he responds this way, as we see in all the synoptic gospels. Have you come out with swords and clubs? The word for club is zulon, which literally means wood. It can be translated as cross, as you can see a number of times here in Acts. And in Revelation 22, it's the tree of life. So there as the wood of the tree. So club only by inference of the kind of wood they'd be carrying with swords would be wood to hit people with as clubs. As if I were a lestes here, a bandit. And bandit has been long shown to be a bad translation, starting with Richard Horsley's work in the 1980s, who highlight this isn't a bandit like someone who's a thief. If you want to use the word bandit, we could say a social bandit, more like a Robin Hood character. People who rob from the rich and give to the poor, and the road from Jericho to Jerusalem at feasts would be a good opportunity to do that, as well as at feasts perhaps in Jerusalem itself, although it would be harder to get away with that. So that would be what's at issue here, is he's another approach to helping the poor deal with the unjust treatment they get from the wealthy. But he leaves that rhetorical question unanswered and continues. When I was with you day after day in the temple, and that's what we've seen both in 1947 and 2143, you did not lay hands on me, or literally stretch out your hands. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. And notice how different that is from what we see in the others. All of this section here is unique to Luke. What we don't have is Mark's unique young man running away naked, who appears not naked at the empty tomb, a uniquely Markan thing that either Matthew didn't understand or he left out. Matthew adds at the end, this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets, but we already saw Jesus named that the scripture had to be fulfilled, referring to Isaiah's suffering servant in Isaiah 52 and 53. So this part is unique here to Luke. This is your hour, noting the narrator's hour for the arrest in Matthew and Mark. As Green notes, there's a certain irony in this, since if Jesus embraces the cup in obedience to the divine purpose, he will also accept the fate willed for him by Satan. And again, that's part of the tension here. Your hour and the power or the authority, using the word exousia, of darkness. as I noted in the introductory video, a number of symbols of Satan and darkness surrounding the situation, highlighting that at one level it's the Jerusalem Sanhedrin and the Roman procurator Pilate who are arresting and charging Jesus, but another hour, as it's been since the beginning, is the devil or Satan who are trying to get Jesus and the others to move away from allegiance to God and to allegiance to the devil, who has the power of violence and death here. So they seize him and let him away, bring him to the high priest's house, and Peter following is at a distance. And that's why I divide this here into those sections where Peter following a distance sets up the chiasm for the next scene, which we'll see next time. See you for that then. Bye-bye.